Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
The open source report, WBRN Radio, or I should say via WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. The date on this is the 12th of November 2019. We have an open source report that cover a number of things. One, if you've been to a meetup recently in the last 2 or 3 years, there is a code of conduct for the meeting, and it is spelled out, basically meaning you can't be a disruptor and you have to be civil. That's basically what it boils out to. We see these codes of conduct popping up all over the place, including public transit. You'll see various transit authorities. We looked at that one time. In many of the major cities have quote-unquote codes of conduct. Well, codes of conduct at meetups, in the case of our reporting, will be at the Linux, one of the Linux Foundation's conferences, and how it is executed is very interesting within itself. Now, codes of conduct, do they in fact impact on speech to the First Amendment? They could. That's one of the reasons we are very hesitant and very skeptical of endorsing many of these codes of conduct. But at the same time, if we go back to the Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, you can't holler fire in a cinema. So in other words, you can't come in with inflammatory type language to excite people or to degrade people, language that is sexist, homophobic, racist, etc. And evidently in the case in hand, I looked at it from a number of angles here. There was a Medium article, we'll get to that in a minute here, on the issue. Won't go into what the people were doing on Twitter, as many people now are aware of that many people use Twitter. We've always been favorable to Twitter over, say, Facebook. But if you get into a lot of individualized comments, our activity on Twitter is basically around retweeting various activities, people, their views, etc. We very seldom put out messages on our own, which is neither here nor there. I can recall we had the Usenet groups that goes back a bit during the trial of the century. That was the People versus Orenthal James Simpson on the O.J. Simpson group. There was all kinds of comments made, flames throwed from various people. Period there. All kinds of racist language appeared in there. We had the head of one of the clans was there. All kinds of characters popped into that group, and at that time there was no code of conduct. Now there were instances that people we're talking about circa 1995, 96, that era, that people were threatened with defamation suits. I can recall personally some woman asked our internet provider at the time to cancel our account. Well, what was the reason for canceling the account? It was not a tax on her. It was supporting O.J. Simpson. And so that's a different kind of situation. But the country as a whole, in terms of discourse, we hope that has matured since that particular time in the very early days. And of course, at that time, we did not have presidents on Twitter, and that came later. Presidential accounts under President Obama, Barack Obama had one, and so did G.W. Bush. But they did not use their private accounts, such as the real Donald Trump, to attack people or to send out policies. Now, we have virtually everybody is on there. The leader in Bolivia that is now on his way, it should be in Mexico for political asylum. He was on Twitter, so everyone is on Twitter. That's really not an issue here. But the issue is these various meetings, their code of conduct, and their enforcing of complaints against an individual on what they call tone. Now, that in itself is a very, very interesting point there, and the reservation to one of their conferences was canceled because of that type of behavior. Now, this would be, people have been thrown out of meetup groups before. People are even thrown off of Twitter or Facebook. And it depends if you have a political dimension. But I was listening at Lundy on the West Coast out there. I think he's out of Portland, Oregon, or someplace of that nature, that area, basically saying that open source was not political. Well, open source is very political. And if you look at the Free Software Foundation or whatever, there are many things covering open source software, including patents and various other things in hardware, that the copyright laws, etc., are political because they are passed in this country by the Congress. The extension even of something, say, public, that is a domain of the Congress and other forces to be, including the Library of Congress. But the whole point there is it is very, very political. And at this stage of history, we have more and more of these. In fact, virtually all of them. I've not seen a meetup yet, even if it was on basket weaving, that didn't have that universal code of conduct. So that has now went to the various larger meetings. They have codes of conduct also there. So if someone runs afoul of that. But the point we want to make here, that it is political, and we thought we would speak out on this. But let's get to, as we normally do on these reports, the kernel. It's what stable version is 5.3.10. That is the stable version of the Linux kernel. The long-term version is 4.19.83. And they are in the 5 points. So depending obviously on which version of Linux that you have. On one Ubuntu version we have, I believe we're up to 4.9.60, something of that nature. Still in the fours there. We might actually be, several long-term here. It could be 4.9. No, not that. No, not at all. But anyway, this is the kernel and how the kernel is set out. We do advise people to get the latest kernel for their distribution that they can. Our Slackware distribution, I can't recall right at this point in time what it is, but we use it from a current. So it's basically the larger one. It's just on this portable device here. We use Ubuntu basically for driver purposes, not anything else. Anyway, nonetheless, let's get on here. I think we'll finish this up. Here we go. This is a very, very long article. I don't think I will append it. I think we'll just briefly go over what happened here. We won't get into all the individuals, but this is Propaganda and Other Lies We Tell, and this is by Cheryl Scarlett, of all things. She's writing on the November on the Medium. Medium, very interesting situation here. She goes into some classic things that you're taught in media courses. I've been taking some media courses the last few years. Anyway, influencing an audience, and I'll just start out. Many of us have large audience, and none of us are trained to know how to handle them, even truly grapple with the reach of those platforms we build in the cyber world. People are horror the word influencer, and that's talked about all the time in media material. Anyway, because it sounds manipulative. But we are honest, and we do influence people. And maybe that's not our primary goal, but well, if you own something like Instagram, it is. But oftentimes it is, even if we don't admit it. The size of our audience is often obfuscated by the fact that we are online and can't see the volumes of people. And the audience that is out there, and she has 17,000 followers. DJ Trump has, 60 million followers? I think something like that. Anyway, honestly, we never really talk about what that means. And there's a website, you can visualize that. If you go to that website, it literally will show you what your followers look like. Ours would be kind of an empty stadium. Anyway, this just shows a picture here. And we'll link her article, I believe, on this. I can honestly say I did not picture myself in a hockey arena-sized stadium and nearly sold out when I tweet. Well, I imagine not. Okay, I have 17,000 followers. What does this mean? And that's not how social media works. Social media wants more people than those that follow you to see what you say. How many people am I really talking about? She really has no idea on that. People retweeted impressions here. So what does 45,000 people? Well, there are pictures here, and you see this later. A top tweet earned 27,000 impressions. A lot of impressions. I'll have to retweet some of her stuff here then. Well, and again, this is what they look like in a stadium. And she has several tweets here. One tweet, 449,000 impressions, and so forth and so on. Not sure what that was. A picture of something. All kinds of things appear on Twitter. You can have something that is very, very unusual. Anyway, Amy King and John Summit, that's how you pronounce his name, and some character by the name of Charles Wood. Charles Wood was the one banned from the conference. And these people also do podcasts. I won't get into too much of what they do there. But they have podcasts going there. Amy King, grateful I didn't start my program journey in 2019. Anyway, I won't get. You can look at this for yourself. Get into what these various characters are talking about, and some of the tweets that they focus on here have since been deleted. So again, you're not going to get much of the story here. Let's see what else here. I personally tweeted about the importance of anger, facets of messaging where paint anger as negative, and I urge you to listen to the TED Talk and the podcast in these. Well, I didn't know there was a TED Talk there. But as reference to Nigerian developers and how they tend to be positive and so forth and so on here. This John Summit here is attacked. He's supporting this Amy. Anyway, and then there's a Kim Creighton here that is in the mix. She evidently is an African American, period. And it's the same guy here, John Summit. Columbus is such a badass. I've decided to celebrate him for one more day. Well, basically what he's saying, that's a reaction there, and calling the indigenous people savages. Well, these things are attention distractions, or whatever you want to call them. No, that's just basically what shows up. Not a lot you're going to be able to do about that. That's just one of those. You'll have a lot of this back and forth on Twitter. But how does this back and forth deposit itself? This event happened around the 30th of October this year. A close friend, he said, by the name of Charles Wood, decided it was time to say something. Well, I guess Wood said it. And Uncle Bob Martin, anyway, Robert Martin does here. Anyway, there's Martin and there's this Charles Wood. When I post this, you can look at what is going on here with this Twitter operation they have back and forth here. Even they bring Dr. King into the argument here. I guess essentially saying that Dr. King talked about rebellions in urban centers back in time. You have to realize this is in the 60s, and he just basically said that had there not been more laws against apartheid in the North and in the South, there would be more rebellions. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The Columbus Day thing. So in other words, this is what they call the tone. It got this guy Wood into trouble, and later got Wood banned from the conference there. And that was pretty much the end of that. And that would be the end of that. But one thing to realize, within the programming community, there is a conservative trend there, and there's no doubt about that. And that is what we are fighting against. Many of these reactionaries oppose open source. Now, open source is not brought up here, but I'm assuming this person has something to do with the community. Statement here, being polite just simply doesn't work. Well, whatever. And he also had on an America First cap, evidently. Well, having on an American First cap or a Bernie cap doesn't demote anything, unless obviously this person is signifying some of the vowel parts of the America First, and evidently that's what he was doing. This guy Charles Wood. Yeah, so again, Wood is, like many others, a self-promoter, it appears here. I don't know. But again, if you read the Medium article here, you can see basically what is going on there, and why this Lundy character out there said that basically open source was not political, and went on to do a short. He has a short show on why it was not political. But evidently he had never studied political science in his life, or if he did, he missed the point. All things are political in the final analysis. But again, this is a situation where there's obviously some disagreement, but at the same time there is a Cubicon is the name of the particular conference here, and this was the one this character was booted out of, was Cubicon. Some people, this is the Linux Foundation. Hi all, we have reviewed social and video and determined that the code of conduct was violated, and this registration to the event has been revoked. Our event should and will be a safe place. That is what they said here. And the code of conduct, all event participants are expected to behave in accordance with professional standards with both this code of conduct as well as their respective employers' policies governing appropriate work. Now, a lot of these people at these conferences work for people, and Wood evidently got his invitation from someone, one of the sponsors of the conference, which there would be a lot of people sponsoring the conference period. So this is kind of what happened at Cubicom there. That's pretty much the story there, and some other people intervene in this argument here. But Cheryl, I'm not going to accept that he doesn't have all the information now, but I compiled it. I won't accept that other people chiming in don't have all the information either. So that's what she said. I guess you'd say we spent more time on this, but the code of conduct moving forward, as a code of conduct, if the whole idea is to have a less disruptive and to have an environment that's based on humanity, this is what we talk about when we talk about Ubuntu. And in all of our programs, you hear from the late President Nelson Mandela, and explaining what Ubuntu is, and the code of conduct would fit in there, so that's what they're trying to do. Now, we acknowledge that code of conduct can also be used to suppress certain types of other speech out there. Facebook has something where they can ban people, and there's really no firm policy. It's a little different. But this was thought out. They did review it, and they just decided this individual was Sobiambi. Anyway, let's move on here to some open source here. This is by Adrian Bridgewater. Is open source broken? Very interesting article in Forbes here. We've used Forbes before, and open source software has changed the environment to develop applications, all manners of IT services through the open source model is fundamentally rooted in the notion of community contributions. But things have shifted in terms of use. Open source software is free to download, but the user is encouraged to give back. That's to the community via the physical code commitment portion of the software that the project may use. Now, there are different projects. We talked about that before here, and other supportive activities such as local language translations, organizing special interest group users, and by simply promoting the existence of an open alternative to proprietary closed products like Windows, etc. In theory, examining the state of open source software. This discussion is a contribution to the cause. In terms of monetarization, you hear this popping up, especially with the internet, radio, podcasts. Many of these people offer some types of enumeration, depending on what you get. Anyway, now the old general model then, we had a big argument back in, I think, 2000 with some people from Red Hat. Successful open source projects often generate enterprise versions. At that time, they had regular Red Hat, which was open source, and they were just moving towards their enterprise version. So was SUSE and some others. Anyway, and IBM had certified Red Hat as a Linux distribution, one that they would work with. Now Ubuntu also has that certification, and I believe SUSE has. They've kind of changed that. In other words, they're often labeled E to denote a higher level status. An enterprise version of an open source software product usually comes with support and maintenance. And there's no big problem in consultancy service and deep levels of additional functionality. Sometimes it does. And if you look at Oracle Linux, purchase of the database there, anyway. But things have changed in open source, where proprietary behemoths in the text entry once referred to open source as a cancer. They're talking about Microsoft. The approach embraced. The new approach is to embrace. No firm has come out about the face in this regard more than Microsoft. The once a proprietary-only software company positions its Windows operating system as a closed-door best choice on the market. The company now positively welcomes Linux. They do in their Xare and their cloud product. Anyway, Microsoft's purchased several open source companies, including coding tool Xamarin and the version control specialist GitHub, which we either go to or put things there. It's the highest level. Microsoft's pledged to operate GitHub as an independent business. Now remember the word business there. Coding purists would have stood for nothing less in order to retain the strength of its platform community and retain its product philosophy. Now many people have left there, and the chief operating officer there is Erica Brasetker. She was speaking at a recent open source summit in France there. Brasetker explained where she thinks open source is going, what the monetary changes it faces, challenges, and what you do to help the revolution succeed. Well, it's an evolution, not a revolution. Noting that 98% of all software projects rely on open source connections or core concepts in one way or the other, one form or the other. Brasina said that what is changing now is open source is monetized. Well, open source has been monetized in the sense that these consulting models have been there since we started out with open source in the early 90s, and before that shareware in the late 80s. Anyway, and have open software models work in the age of cloud computing. Now, this is where the challenges are. We are seeing an increased tension between open source projects and open source companies. No doubt about that. It goes back to discussion we had out in Santa Cruz, California, at a conference there for anyway, SCO, the Santa Cruz operation, was a version of Unix that was partially owned at that time by Microsoft. They finally got it back. Anyway, we were at a Caldera conference, and Caldera bought the Linux version from the networking people. Forget who they were now, but anyway, Caldera is long gone now. They went up against IBM and didn't come out on the short end. Licenses applied to open source projects a decade ago do not contemplate the possibility of a cloud vendor delivering software as a service using the project without contributing, which is leaving some open companies in a challenging position. No doubt about that. This is from Bracena here. From her perspective, Bracena says she is practically interested in open source development support projects like GitHub sponsors and there in the community bridge. We'll talk a little bit about this. That's from the Linux Foundation. She suggested what matters now is we, the software community. Now, is she talking about this in generic sense? Can use these types of platforms delivering funding to open source projects and individuals support the work they do. Well, very good idea there, but it doesn't exactly happen that way. She goes on to say, I'm particularly passionate about global expansion. Well, open source has always been global. I can remember my interaction with these German developers and developers all over the world. Now the Chinese are in it, and they're moving along there. Our earlier interaction with Chinese developers in Red Linux. They had Red Linux out at one time. And they were also working towards processors, and that was when the head of Intel at the time said, well, we shouldn't have a national processor, CPU, whatever it would have been there. They just need the Intel. Now we know that we do. Anyway, is open source broken? The question she asked here. It's undeniable then, open source software has changed. Beseeker has said, referring to the points of tension but stem from companies using innovation, open source innovation as infrastructure. We can think of that if we go to the Apache project and Hadoop there, and it is one of the cores of many things. Cloudera that recently now interconnected with another one of these providers there, basically Hadoop, with a front end on it that makes life a little bit easier. Anyway, we can look at the risks of international bifurcation, and not even mention the potential for Brexit. Anyway, disconnections. The way pure open source should be accessed, global users, and users agnostic, democratic, based fairly upon a system of meritocracy. We might perhaps hope that this is the author of the article here. Beseeker and her team aligned with Microsoft as they are. This is a practical, practical function of the industry. We worked hard to do the right thing, so the open mission itself will continue in a way it should. Well, there is a big problem there. There always is a problem when you are dealing with the political system and the nature of capitalism. Now, open source, and this is one of the places the Open Source Foundation is correct, because what we're seeing here is an evolution from open source to library or free software. Open source software, you can share it, but you don't actually own it. Libra software is for anyone is a higher level of development. Dr. Stallman was correct about that. And some numbers here. The Octaverse program, 1.3 million time contributors joined the open source community this year, plus 3.6 million software code repositories, depending on each of the top 50 open source projects. But there is a top 50, but beyond the top 50, there are many, many more out there. And we'll just take a quick look at these as we move along here. Thought we would spend a little bit of time. This is a community bridge. It's in the article there. Community bridge enabling developers to build, support, and grow their open source projects. Now, the community bridge here enables maintainers to raise funds so they can sustain and grow their projects by paying for development events or infrastructure. Now, our friend over there at Slackware, how would that benefit him? I'm not sure if he'd want to be in anything of this nature. Anyway, support contributors through training and certifications, paid internships, mentoring, and job opportunities. This is by the Linux Foundation, but this gets the commercial people more into it, increased enterprise adoption by reducing security concerns. Well, no doubt about that. And there are software products to do that. Eliminate busy work by offloading administrative tasks. So in other words, if they're offloading some of the administrative tasks, they're taking it over, such as invoicing, tax forms, license enforcement. That's kind of dodgy. But anyway, it'll be in the basic article there from the person at Forbes, and you can then go there as I went here. Now, this is Octaverse is the other one here. Now, was mentioned here, the state of Octaverses, whatever Octaverse is, here we go. Pass 10 million new developers joined the GitHub community, contribute 44 million plus repositories across every continent on Earth. Behind the world's code is a global and growing team of contributors. 80% of them are contributing from outside the U.S. Now, this is a very interesting development here because we have an international situation on a platform called GitHub that is owned by Microsoft. Octaverse is growing more interconnected as it's become easier to find and build on the work of others around the globe. And some of the top open source projects not only have thousands of contributors, their dependencies for millions of repositories. How development works is also fastly changing. And this fast-changing development, if you go back to, we done back, I think it was in 2000, and the whole idea of socialist software development, it will come up, as it does everywhere else. And as it comes up more, you have this interdependency, international dependency. Some of these things will be worked out. Development work is changing fast, and with the new ways people work together across passionate projects, open source software, and that companies elsewhere more ease and security than ever before to celebrate 365 days of achievement. Let's look back at the code and community built on GitHub this year. Well, the thing was, it was already here in 2019, a year of this report. Again, developers of individual accounts on GitHub, regardless of their activity. Location information is for users based on their last location. Organizations are best known there, and it's just some of the ways they do it. And then organizations also have accounts there for their people. Now, there are alternatives to GitHub, and some of the developers have went there. There are 40 million plus developers on GitHub, including 10 million new ones. And a lot of these are coming from China. On our last broadcast, we talked about China pull requests emerged in the last year. And it was 87 million there, and more developers opened their first pull requests in 2019 than in 2018. The next generation developers in schools around the world, and this year more than 760,000 are learning on GitHub. There's no doubt about this. I also take IT courses at the university. Yes, GitHub does come in there. And in IT shops, the GitHub is there. And this is forcing people to think more about open source and some of the proprietary. It depends, obviously, on which shop you're in. 31,000 total teachers have used GitHub in their courses to teach real-world development workflow, 33% more than last year. Total students that have learned to code on GitHub, 55% more. I can see that happening because of the cost of education. 761,000 active students learned and built with GitHub's development pack. We'll find out. There's a nice little star by it there. And 70% of global Fortune 50 companies have made a contribution open source in the last Fortune 500. No, it is Fortune 50. Made contributions. 29 are building software behind their businesses on, and there's an industrial version of GitHub, no doubt about that. So, in some of the open source at work, they mentioned Spotify here. Zedek, Stripe, these are some of the people there. Spotify, incidentally, you can hear us on the Spotify platform. It's a music platform. Many of these very large type of operations are there. Every year since 2014, we have seen more open source contributions from outside the U.S. This is a changing of open source software. Top 20 regions outside the U.S. by open source use. Clones and fork. China, India, Germany. Developers in China have forked or cloned 48% more projects than last year. And it's just, if I look sideways here, behind Germany is the UK, United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, France, Russia, Brazil, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, Australia, the Republic of Korea, Spain, Ukraine, Poland, Singapore, Indonesia, Taiwan, and then Vietnam. We haven't seen anyone on the African countries in here. Some of the Asian countries are there. Something we need, obviously, to work on by introducing, private repositories, allowing developers to work across as many private depositories as possible. Now, this is the increasing capitalist nature of GitHub. Here we go. Oh, we finally have moved to regional code and creativity are no short supply across Africa. Developers are creating 40% more open source repositories this year than last. Morocco 65%, Kenya 54%, Nigeria 50%, Egypt 49%, South Africa 40%, Guinea-Bissau 550%, Chad 322%, Niger 260%, Rwanda 207%, Sierra Leone 219%, Congo, DRC 169%, and finally Somalia, of all places, 162%. So they are number 10. I didn't give the numbers. Sorry about that. Congo, South Sudan, I've got about them 9 and 10, and Rwanda is 7. Sierra Leone, let's go back to the top here and see who these other countries are. Morocco is number 1, Kenya is number 2, Nigeria is 50%, and South Africa is 5th fastest growing African countries by contribution of more than 10,000 contributors in 2019. Morocco, Kenya, and Nigeria saw up to 70%. Fastest growing contributors, African countries on GitHub by contributors less than 10. That's the smaller countries. Guinea-Bissau is in that. So in other words, it is getting around. I don't know if we have the Americas here or not. I guess we don't. The rest of the Americas, we don't have them to see where they are. But it does tell us a little bit about some projects like Rails and Facebook Rails and Axion are used by millions. This is some 3.6 there. So this is a very interesting situation where open source has grown. Packages and dependencies by language. This is the top 50 packages here. JavaScript, Python, Ruby, etc. have an incredible number of dependent projects despite having an average of less than 40 direct contributors. Now this is some of what is going on here. And I think we'll go ahead and append this because there are the top 10 open source projects with the most dependencies. TensorFlow, we've talked about TensorFlow before, that depends on Python project, 19,000. TensorFlow community is no exception. And then we have PyTest and some other things that use testing type software. TensorFlow is in here. And, we'll leave it at that and move along here because we've spent a little time on GitHub, but we are doing pretty good time-wise here. Python is moving ahead of Java. That is Krebs on security. Looked at his arvits.com. I don't know who they are. Hundreds of internet passwords on Pastebin. This is a Vermont retailer here that specializes in high, fishing flies. You do a lot of fly fishing. Other sports. Leaked hundreds of internal passwords. Pastebin.com for several weeks last month, exposing the credentials the company used to manage everything from firewalls to routers to administrative accounts. Exposure here, based in Sutherland, Vermont, founded in 1856, privately held. Orvet is the oldest mail order retailer in the U.S. The company has approximately 1,700 workers, and it has 69 retail stores, 10 outlets in the U.S. and 18 in the U.K. Late October, the offer received a tip from a Wisconsin-based security firm, Wohl Security, that a file containing a staggering number of internal usernames and passwords from Orvets had been posted on Pastebin and reached for comment about the source documents. Orvets spokesman Tucker Kimball said it was only available for a day before the company had it removed. I hope so. The file contained old credentials. Some of the many devices associated with the credentials are decommissioned. We took steps to address remaining ones, according to Kimball. However, according to Wohl Security's founder, Alex Holder, this enormous password file was actually posted to Pastebin on two separate occasions last month. The first on October the 4th and the second on October 22nd. That finding a collaboration by 4Q.com, a company that aggregates information for leaked databases online. They didn't respond, evidently not, to Mr. Krebs here for comment via phone and email. The last two emails sent by Krebs on security to Orvets were returned simply as blocked. It's not unusual for workers or contractors to post bits of sensitive information to public sites like Pastebin or GitHub, but the credential file apparently published by someone working at or for the Orvets is by far the most extreme example he has witnessed, and he should know that. That is spelled O-R-V-I, yeah. Anyway, so for instance here, it includes Pastebin file, Orvet, plain text users and passwords for just about any kind of online service you come up with: antivirus engines, data backup, multiple firewall products, Linux servers, Cisco routers, NetFlow data call recording service, DNS control. Oh boy, about everything here you can name. There's a whole company basically there. Oracle databases, Apple ID, FTP credentials, mobile payment services, all of this, all these accounts. Anyway, that was what that one was all about there. Ransomware, data breach at hospitals tied to uptick in fatal heart attacks. Hospitals have been hit by these data breaches or ransomware. Could expect to see an increase in death rates amongst heart patients in the following months or years because of the cybersecurity remedies effort. A new post there. Healthcare experts say that findings that should prompt a larger review of security. No doubt about that. Researchers at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management took the Department of Health and Human Services list of healthcare data breaches and used it to drill down on the data about patient mortality rates at about more than 3,000 Medicare certified hospitals, about 10% of which had experienced a data breach, according to PBS. The Vanderbilt study, after the data breaches are an additional 36 additional deaths per 10,000 heart attacks occurring annually. Researchers found that for care centers that experienced a breach, it took an additional 2.7 minutes for suspected heart attack patients to receive their electrocardiogram. And the exploitation of cyberspace vulnerability is killing people. That is Gordon Scullin, former deputy chief of security officer at HHS there. And then similar finding this report begs for similar study in the UK. So the wannabe virus was in it. That was in 2017. The National Health Service, that is in the UK, found that the New England Journal, that was in 2017, of medicine would seem to suggest applying the approach used by Vanderbilt researchers to measure patient outcomes at UK hospitals in the wake of the WannaCry virus might be worth carrying out. No doubt about that. It found that Medicare beneficiaries who were admitted to marathon-affected hospitals with acute myocardial infarction or cardiac arrest were longer in the marathon dates, had longer ambulance transportation time at 4.4 minutes and higher 30-day mortality rates than those that did not. So this is one of the things. Let me just get one other story and we'll give it up. This involves, maybe we'll get it next to it there. This involves one of the VPNs that got breached. He had reported this. But anyway, the takeaway here is watch out for VPNs. This VPN was the Nordic VPN. I hope I got the name right. I don't have my cheat sheet here. But it was breached, and they discovered the breach much, much later, over a year or so later than when it was first breached. So I don't see it right now. Here we go. It's Avast. Now, Avast is AVAST. They bought CC Cleaner. Anyway, and the virtual private network Nord VIP each today disclosed a month-long network intrusion that otherwise unrelated shares comment anyway. Forgotten stuff there. Avast is in the Czech Republic itself, the most popular antivirus out there. It has 435 million users. In a blog post said it detected and addressed a breach between May and October of 2019 that appeared to be targeted at users of CC Cleaner. That is a Windows product. I've used it many times. It also has a mobile application there. And evidently they updated the product via automatic updates on the 15th of October, just recently here. As far as the Nordic VP, Best said the intrusion began when attackers, used stolen credentials from a VPN service that was configured to connect to its internal network, and the attackers were not challenged with any sort of multi-factor authentication, one-time code generated by a mobile device. We found that the internal network was successfully accessed there, and the VPN was compromised. In fact, Dave out of Australia had it on his telecast. You can find him at the EEV blog, one word there, Dave Jones. He has a nice video on that, and hopefully we'll link that video, because find out a little about these VPNs and what actually happened with the VPNs. Anyway, that is the breach tied to Phantom users' account. Let's see. Incidentally, AMD has some very, very fast processors out now, and their Ryzen processors this is one. We have their 8-core. We don't have this is a 12 cores. We can go up to 12 cores. And these are in some specialized systems here. This is actually their desktop one. The AMD processors provide real-world performance for workers, whether you are pivoting huge data sets and designs, etc. And this is, for example, this is the Ryzen 7 Pro 3600 offers up to 127% fast performance on financial loads, compared to this would be Intel's i7 9700 workload there. I mean, it doesn't matter as much as if you have one of these types of machines. Their machine is obviously faster. Photo editing, video editing, not as much faster, but it's a little, 167%, 52% there. And some of these various, the Intel Core, the various Ryzen devices, there's some out there still fairly expensive deployment, but this is their Pro. I'm not sure why they wasted on Windows 10, though. That is kind of a waste within itself. Anyway, it's out there, and that's more the Pro processors at the enterprise level there, 375 processor. Anyway, so much from AMD there. You can go there. Still listed at AMD resell, although we have not sold any AMD products in many, 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 many moons. So many moons we forgot how to sell them. And this is from Tech Republic here. I think we have room for this. Open source is heavily interdependent community, which is good and bad for security. This is by Matt Assay in the Tech Republic, and you write this on the 11th of November, so it is out here. Open source is all about community, no doubt about that. Ubuntu, which is usually a good thing, and no, I'm referring to sometimes unwelcome nature of different communities. Instead, I'm referring to the interlopers who have hijacked different projects in so-called supply chain attacks, like web admin and Ruby Gens exploits. Those were fixed here. Open source has never been an American thing, while North American developers have long played an important part in fostering open source development. Many of the more prominent projects, and this is the whole thing here. MySQL, I talked about it earlier. Linux come out of Europe. This is isn't particularly surprising given Europe's penchant for community mindedness. While developers living in the U.S. remain the single largest group of contributors, as since 2014, the number of open source contributors originating outside the U.S. has ballooned. We just covered that. The GitHub state of Oversea here, and anyway, we won't go back over that. It's early in the broadcast. We had that in. And, of course, in China, developers there contribute dramatically more than any country except the U.S. That activity is accelerating. Developers in China forked and cloned 48% of the projects, more projects than last year, according to the report. Even so, not nearly as fast as a growth in Nigeria. That's good to hear Nigeria is growing. Python beat Java for the number 2 spot on GitHub list there. And we'd seen that before, and this again is Erica Barceller there, and what she was talking about, workflow code level, and their depositories in general, not the case that bad faith developers submitting a pull request to introduce backdoors or vulnerabilities into the code. One of the greatest things about open source is intended to depend on developers earning the right to commit code through consistent and valuable contributions there. No doubt about that. The idea of some rogue developer doing a drive-by when the RubyGen exploit that saw developer Matt Manning's account credentials breached, and that's where I suppose that one happened. I was unaware of Mr. Manning's, but anyway, it's out there. With the GitHub Universe this week in San Francisco, I suspect we'll hear more announcements related to supply chain security, perhaps emerging from the Seminole acquisition, and needlessly, and I'm not sure. Security researcher Simel to quickly find vulnerabilities uses security and declare queries, simple declarative queries. These teams then share the queries with the CML community to improve the safety of code or code bases. Software security is a community effort. No single company can find every vulnerability. There's no doubt about that. Impossible to do. And we'll see. I mean, where this goes. Anyway, it's a good way to end the broadcast. This is the Open Source Report. And we do this with Cranston Software. This is MA at Cranston Software. And on the 12th of November 2019, you can find us on iHeartRadio, the iHeart mobile map, on Spotify and their mobile app, on Stitcher, on Twitter, and on Spreaker. They have a mobile map. They have a website. You can go there. And hopefully our RSS feed is working. I'll need to check on that. Anyway, good day, and we'll see you later. And sorry about not having more broadcasts up here. We try to do these broadcasts at least 2 times bi-monthly, but sometimes we fall a little short.